can't fish right where the site's at, because the land's contaminated and stuff.
You don't cut off a man's life at 33.
Every man, woman, and child who works in this nation has got to know that he or she is handling hazardous material or that they're being exposed to it.
Environmentalists and organized labor have always worried about their children. And I think most of us worry about a job because we want things better for our children. We want to send them to high school and to college. Environmentalists worry about clean water and clean air for ourselves, but mostly for our children. We still want them to see the mountains and the canyons in their lifetime. Well, I'm scared stiff for our children.
Acid rain, toxic waste, PCBs. Do we understand these hazards to our health? Many of us do, because our lives and our families' lives have been deeply affected. The fact is that all of us are at risk. Our awareness of chemical threats on the job and in our communities is a critical step toward changing toxic Earth. But what's our government doing to protect us at home and at work? What's our government doing to protect our children? Workers and environmentalists realize that they share a common concern. The same toxic chemicals that damage workers' health also seep into our water, pollute our air, and endanger the health of millions of Americans in communities all around the country. That's why labor unions and environmental groups have joined together to work in organizations like the OSHA Environmental Network.
We started with clean air, and we started with occupational safety and health. And so already in 3.5 years, we've gotten beyond the experimental stage, and we've all, I think, been impressed with our own knowledge that there are, in fact, many more issues that unite us than divide us.
In the 40s and 50s, there was little awareness of the toxic effects of chemicals, even among scientists, and what was known was usually kept from the public. Workers breathed toxic fumes and routinely handled dangerous chemicals. Today, there are more than 100,000 chemicals in use. New substances are introduced daily. Not all are poisonous, but government research has identified 45,000 with toxic effects. Of those, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, regulates 450 and applies hazard labels to only 21. An estimated 20 million workers will be exposed to potentially dangerous chemicals on the job. George Zerwis was one of them. He worked in an industrial laboratory in Iowa City in 1965. He used benzene to analyze soil samples.
You could smell the benzene all through the lab. It was even to the point where it could be smelled in the offices, in our offices on the next floor above.
Benzene, a common solvent, has been in use since World War II. In the late 70s, it was officially identified as a potential cause of cancer and regulated under OSHA emergency standards. But it was too late for George. He contracted leukemia.
It has been known, has been reported in the literature before that time, all the way back to 1928, that benzene was associated with leukemia, and that I think the manufacturers of benzene knew it at the time, but was not generally known by the public or people such as George and myself.
I don't want what's happened to me to happen to someone else. I think being aware of the hazards and being protected from them as best possible is something that should be taken care of, so that you don't cut off a man's life at 33.
George died a year later, and in spite of strong evidence, an industry lawsuit resulted in OSHA's emergency standards being struck down. According to U.S. government figures, more than 100,000 Americans die annually from diseases caused by occupational exposures, and another 1 million are disabled. But our outdated workmen's compensation system recognizes and compensates fewer than 10% of these victims. Among many industrial workers, such as coal miners, textile workers, foundry workers, and others, 1 out of 4 develop cancer related to agents in the workplace. OSHA was signed into law in 1970 and is administered by the Department of Labor. OSHA's inspections forced companies to invest in new, safer manufacturing practices, free from hazards to workers. Stiff fines were imposed on companies not in compliance with OSHA standards. Among OSHA's beneficiaries were the textile workers, routinely exposed to cotton dust, causing brown lung disease. OSHA's cotton dust standard offers some protection for workers, but without such regulations, 1 in 7 textile workers is likely to contract bisonosis. Things are different now. Big business seems to be winning the battle for workers' safety. The former head of OSHA under the Reagan administration, Thorne Octor, is a businessman whose family construction firm earned 49 OSHA citations and $1,400 in fines over the past 10 years. He made it clear that he would sharply curtail OSHA's regulations.
That direction was to reflect the basic thrust of this administration, to increase the level of risk that the society and its members are expected to tolerate in the name of getting government off our backs. At the Labor Department, OSHA has been systematically immobilized in its enforcement, and many of its previous health standards have been formally challenged. By whom? By the government administrators of those standards, by OSHA itself.
Since 1980, because of budget cuts, OSHA closed 1/3 of its field offices and dropped 30% of its staff. Shop floor inspections have dropped 58%. Penalties have dropped 80%. And perhaps worst of all, no new standards regulating thousands of manufactured chemicals have been put into effect. More than 13 million Americans were exposed to asbestos in the last 40 years. There was no public awareness because the information was suppressed. Lung cancer caused from this mineral takes years to develop. As many as 200,000 people may die from asbestos-associated cancers in the next 20 years. Workers who came home with asbestos particles on their clothes may have contaminated family members. In one study, 1 out of 3 family members showed signs of lung abnormalities. Workers brought home other substances as well. The case of the agricultural chemical Roslyn is, unfortunately, not atypical.
I came in contact with Roslyn numerous ways. It was an open system for handling. My uniform came home to be washed. There's a chance my wife could have been exposed, through my uniform.
During the 1.5 years of production of Roslyn at their plant in Rensselaer, New York, there were no known normal pregnancies and several cases of heart defects.
A company spokesman for the holder of the trademark on the herbicide insists there is no pattern of birth defects in plants that manufacture Roslyn. It simply is a coincidence of circumstance, their man said.
If it is a game of multiple coincidences, somebody was playing with loaded dice. These kids didn't have a chance.
They did a open heart surgery when he was 3 weeks old. This child has gone through so much surgery and poking and that you or I will never see in our lifetime, and he is only 4 years old.
He died in 1984. OSHA has yet to issue a standard for Roslyn. It's now being produced in Muskegon, Michigan. Strong limits are critical to prevent exposure to toxic substances in the workplace and in our communities. And we have the right to know if we are in any possible danger from hazardous substances. Some 20 states have passed worker right-to-know laws, and a few states have community right-to-know laws. While every state should provide information to communities and workers about toxic exposures, the right-to-know laws have run into trouble, particularly from chemical companies. The chemical companies don't want to reveal the ingredients of their toxic products because they say it would be giving away trade secrets. New regulations from the Reagan administration now allow chemical companies to decide what you should know, if anything, about your exposure to toxic substances.
It's interesting to me that we have under the Food and Drug Administration regulations over things like cosmetics and certain food products and additives, where before that product can be put on the market, the manufacturer must prove that it's safe. Now, we all have a choice in those things, whether we use those cosmetics or eat those foods or drink those beverages or whatever. We have a choice. We don't have much choice in the workplace. We don't have much choice in the water we drink. We certainly don't have any choice in the air we breathe.
The Clean Air Act required the EPA to regulate air pollution from automobiles, trucks, buses, and 20,000 factories and power plants. Industry resistance to the Clean Air Act has grown since the 70s. There has been widespread non-compliance to the standards. The Clean Water Act of 1972 was enacted to restore the nation's rivers and lakes. Industry discharges over 400 million tons of toxic chemicals into our water annually. Under Ann Gorsuch Burford, the Reagan administration sought to roll back water quality standards, making it easier for industry to pollute. The Environmental Protection Agency was established to protect us and our environment. Has it? Acid rain is the byproduct of emissions from fuel-burning plants and factories. The winds carry the pollutants and combine with precipitation to form acids. Acid rain destroys our forests, our rivers and lakes. An acidified lake looks clear and blue, but in reality it is a watery desert where no living thing can survive. The technology exists to cut emissions, and when the EPA came up with a plan, it was a weak one. Reagan rejected it. While we wait for another plan, acid rain still falls.
Now is the time to put an end to the deadly precipitation that is killing our fish, forests, and streams, and draining the public coffers of at least $5 billion each year.
Elizabeth, New Jersey, 1980. 30,000 barrels of toxic waste explode, injuring more than 100 people. This could happen at any one of the estimated 30,000 hazardous waste sites across the country. And the problem is growing. 275 million tons of new hazardous wastes are generated from manufacturing every year. That's more than 1 ton for every person in the United States. The EPA regulates hazardous waste, but only 1% of active sites have received thorough inspections. No new substance has been added to the hazardous waste list in 4 years. And only 50 million of the 275 million tons of waste are regulated. In Old Forge, Pennsylvania, transformers stored by a local electric company leaked PCBs, or polychlorinated bipanels, a known cancer-causing agent. Wind blew the dust laden with PCBs to a surrounding neighborhood. A state health survey revealed that many residents have PCB levels higher than normal.
You can't fish right where the site's at, because the land's contaminated and stuff. And you walk down there with your shoes, and it gets on your shoes, and you walk back up to your house, and you track it in your house, and it's there. Then it doesn't go away.
The government is removing the transformers after intense public outcry. But more than 2 years passed before any action was taken. The soil is still contaminated. $1.6 billion was allocated under Superfund to clean up abandoned toxic dump sites. In 1982, Superfund came under fire because of alleged mismanagement of funds. 20 EPA officials resigned or were fired, including Ann Gorsuch Burford. And Rita Lavelle went to jail for lying to congressional committees. Only 7 of the 546 priority sites have been cleaned up with Superfund money. At the current rate, it will take the EPA 50 years to clean up currently abandoned hazardous waste sites. Seepage of hazardous waste from the workplace to the community is another problem, one that has surfaced in Silicon Valley, California.
The tank was put in the ground in 1976. Maybe our water was contaminated shortly after that. We don't know.
The leak came from a Fairchild Industries underground storage tank housing solvents to clean silicon printing discs in the high-tech industry. the fiberglass tanks leaked the chemicals downstream to public wells.
Well, they found out about it in November of 1981 or December of 1981. My daughter was born in 1981 with multiple congenital heart defects. Lots of miscarriages on our street. We have a street that's 1 block long, and we had 8 miscarriages on the street in a period of 3 years. How are you doing?
It's very important for people to take an active role when they visit their own physicians with a problem in terms of identifying exposures to toxic substances. Many physicians won't ask the questions that they need to get at this information, and without that information, physician can't establish these kinds of links.
That's why we need right-to-know laws. But it is essential to have clean and safe equipment. In Santa Clara, the fire department now regulates storage and disposal of toxic solvents. The list of ingredients is confidential information, not available to the public.
I think if we knew the amount of chemicals Fairchild had years ago, we would have been a lot more suspicious of them and a lot more protective of our health. The things we were smelling over there coming out of the plant, I think we now know are harmful to us, and we would have been a lot more angry, I think, the first time we smelled it.
Today's environment is the one we will earn and choose by organizing and working on the issues of occupational and environmental health, by demanding right-to-know laws, controls on acid rain, strict regulations and enforcement of standards. The alternative is leaving life and death decisions in the hands of polluting corporations, relying on lax and inadequate government supervision. Our greatest strength is in working together.
We have a challenge as a network and a coalition between environmentalists and labor. We have a challenge to clean up, but in some way to see that that cleanup simply doesn't transfer the pollution someplace else, and to see that in some way people can stay employed at things they want to be employed at and making the sort of wages that they want to make.
Knowledge is power. Our protection depends on us being informed and mobilizing as citizens, locally and nationally. A healthy world is our right, a right guaranteed by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration and by the Environmental Protection Agency. Those who would sacrifice our health and our children's futures must understand that.
There's a coalition out there, a coalition that you don't know about. The environmentalists and labor are together on this issue, and if you attack those two agencies, you attack them, and that's a pretty formidable army for you to be attacking.